eventful and hopefully productive meeting of the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity, combined with another meeting as well. I am State Senator David Givens, have the honor of chairing today's meeting, and I call to order this first meeting of the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity. I do ask everyone in attendance, please silence your cell phones if you would, and I will now recognize lead staff, Mr. Brandon White. Brandon, thank you for 2 years of service now, going on 3, and Committee Staff Assistant Brett Gillespie. Brett, thank you for your continued support of our effort. We're now going to ask Brett to call the roll for the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity, after which we will turn to our chairman, co-chairman, Senator Westerfield today, for the purpose of calling the roll on Juvenile Justice Oversight Council. Brett, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Berg. Senator Neal. Senator Westerfield.
Here.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Hebron.
Present.
Representative Kulkarni.
Present.
Mr. Coleman. Mr. Davis. Ms. Drake. Mr. Jones. Mr. Roberts. Co-Chair Givens.
Present.
Co-Chair Timoney.
Present.
Mr. Westerfield, would you like to order the roll call for the Juvenile Justice Oversight Council?
I'd be happy to, Chairman. Thank you for that. Members, I appreciate you all being here, and Chairman, I thank you all for being willing to let the two groups meet together. I think there's a lot of overlap between the mission of these two groups and the youth that are a focus for the JGOC. Racial disparities has certainly been an object of our discussion over the last several years, so I'm thankful for the time we get to spend together. Before I have our roll called, I want to recognize our newest member, Dr. Katie Marks, who's the Commissioner of DBHDID. All of the Commission on Race members are going to need to tell us what that acronym is. It's a pop quiz. I'm just kidding. Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities. Take that down or memorize DBHDID. Dr. Marks, glad to have you. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Secretary or Madam Secretary? Mr. You want to call the roll? Who's calling the roll for us? Brett, please.
Mr. Adams. Ms. Garner.
Here.
Mr. Gold.
Here.
Ms. Walker. Mr. Ward. Ms. Comstock.
This is Rachel Bingham. I'm sitting in for Ms. Comstock. She is actually going to be our Administrative Office of the Court's new director officially tomorrow, so I am sitting in her spot for today. We're excited to have her.
We're going to let this one time slide.
I know, right?
Ms. Dennis.
Here.
Mr. Glass.
Christina Weeder for Dr. Glass.
Ms. Harvey. Ms. Marks.
Present.
Mr. Preston. Ms. Reed.
Here.
Senator Carroll.
Here.
Senator Webb.
Here.
Representative Bratcher. Representative Herron.
Here.
Senator Westerfield.
Here.
Representative Elliott.
Here. Right, Miss Womack is here for the Secretary, who I believe is with DPA, is he not?
Yes.
With their conference in Lexington, which is also where Mr. Preston is this afternoon. Thank you, Miss Womack. Okay, before we jump into the agenda, I just wanted to take after I turn my mic back on, I wanted to make I just wanted to share something. You know, we do our business up here. This, by the way, has nothing to do with juvenile justice or the Commission on Race at all. But I wanted to just put this on your radars. You know, we do our business up here. We work. We look at legislation. We argue and bicker about it. We vote. We override. We do all the things that we do. But there's still a lot of things that happen around the world and around our state. People go on about their lives, and the people who protect us go on about their work and their lives. And this morning at 10 o'clock, there was a change of command at with the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell at 10 o'clock this morning, where General McGee relinquished command to Major General Brett Sylvia. And I just wanted to recognize that and remind you all that that kind of stuff goes on while we're doing what we do, and I'm thankful for the people that serve where they serve and protect us at Fort Campbell, at Fort Knox, and everywhere else. All right, that's out of the way. Mr. Chairman.
Co-Chair, thank you. And I want to take just a moment and recognize we do have a new member on the Commission of Race and Access to Opportunity. Appreciative of O.J. Oleka and his years of service, but I'd like to acknowledge and offer him the chance to speak briefly because I know his passion, and he speaks not only eloquently, but he can also speak at length. So, Jim Coleman, honored to have you on board. Turn your mic on, introduce yourself to the group, and thanks for joining the team.
Thank you very much, Senator. It is a pleasure being here, and thank you for this great opportunity. I've got a little farm over in Lexington, Kentucky, Coleman Crest Farm, and I'm passionate about workforce development and making sure that all of our residents in the state of Kentucky are prosperous and successful.
Jim, again, thank you, and your story is magnificent. If you haven't had, as members of the commission, if you haven't had a chance to interact with Jim, make it a point to do so. We're thrilled and honored to have him on board. Co-Chair Timoney, opening thoughts.
Really excited about some of the work that we've done. Really excited about the conversations we're having. I know that in the past 6 months, we've come to some pretty impactful decisions. And I think that we're going to need to continue those discussions, critical conversations, with a common goal of everyone prospering. And we're going to have to make some tough decisions. We're going to have to make some tough recommendations. And I think that the Commonwealth is ready for it, and I think we need to do those things. So I'm very optimistic about it. It's not going to be easy, and that's the thing that I think that's above and beyond. I think that when you're talking about issues that we're going to be talking about in both of these committees today, there's not going to be any easy answers because there's no easy road with this. It's going to be a tough path, but it's critical. I think we're to the point right now where it is going to be critical that we do take action. So I'm very excited about being here. I'm very excited about listening to the committee today, and I'm really excited about some of the work that we've got planned. Thank you, Chairman.
Well said. Any other members of either groups wishing to make any statements before we move on into the process and the agenda of the day? One of the things we're always guided by as our work on the commission has taught us over the 2+ years is to reiterate that opening statement of our purpose. And so it's very appropriate that I share with all those listening and or watching our mission statement, purpose statement. The purpose of the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity shall be to conduct studies and research on issues where disparities may exist across the sectors of educational equity, child welfare, health, economic opportunity, juvenile justice, criminal justice, and any other sectors that are deemed relevant in an effort to identify areas of improvement in providing services and opportunities for minority communities in our Commonwealth. With that, I'm excited to introduce our first agenda item for the day. The One Lexington group is going to be coming forward to the table. If they'll come on up to the table, they're going to be providing a program overview, and we ask that Director, as you and your other members of the presentation group come to the table. Once you're seated, make sure all your microphones are showing that green light. You'll push the button. It'll be a bright green light. Please introduce yourselves for the record. We're honored and very appreciative that you've taken the time to be here and to share your story with us.
Definitely. My name is Divine Karama. I am the director of One Lexington. This is Larry Johnson. He's our community outreach coordinator. This is Kenneth Payne. He's heading our crisis response. Thank you to the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity, as well as the Juvenile Justice Oversight Council, for the opportunity to come and talk to you all about the great work that we are doing through One Lexington, but also our community partners and maybe even ways that we can partner with you all. And so just to kind of give you an idea of what One Lexington is, One Lexington was created by our previous mayor back in 2017 in response to the shooting of Tyson Gay's daughter. And Tyson Gay was an Olympic track star from Lexington, Kentucky. And so that incident made national news. And so One Lexington was created. Obviously, in the years following, we got hit with the pandemic, and like many other agencies or programs, it kind of stalled out. So post-pandemic, as well as the social unrest of 2020, like cities all over the country, we saw a huge spike in gun violence in our community. And so our current mayor, Mayor Linda Gorton, revitalized One Lexington, and I was appointed as the director in summer of 2021. And so our mission statement is to leverage government resources and community partnerships to reduce gun violence amongst youth and young adults ages 13 to 29. We chose that age purview because when you look at the data going back 5-10 years, the drivers of violence and those being impacted fell within that age group. And so when I took over in 2021, like many cities, we were in crisis. My first week on the job, we had 4 juveniles shot that week. And so things were really bad. And so we were tasked with 2 things. Obviously, there was an election season looming the next year. We were in the middle of crisis, and we had to stop the bleeding immediately. But also, there was a responsibility of creating a plan to make sure we weren't back here in another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So how do we focus on the root causes, devise this overall plan while also trying to stop the bleeding in the immediate? And so the first thing that we did, I used to laugh and joke with my wife. I told her, I said, I don't know what I'm the director of because One Lexington was just me for the first year or so. And we didn't have a budget. And so we were very intentional about reaching out to other cities who were comparable, not just in size, but demographic, and seeing what evidence-based things were working for them. But a lot of what we were seeing was because of not just the pandemic, but the social unrest. And so there wasn't much data out there yet because we were still in the middle of it in summer of 2021. But there were some practical things, some things that focus more on the root causes that we did pull from some other cities. But then also what we did is we pulled under the tutelage of Cities United, who is our national partner. They helped us with a strategic planning session that pulled in over 30 community partners from Lexington. Because Lexington is a beautiful and a unique city. It is very different from other cities, even within the state of Kentucky. And so this couldn't be a cut and paste, plug and play. We needed to devise a plan that was unique to Lexington. And so we pulled in the school system, which prior to my arrival, there wasn't much collaboration between city government and the school system, which blew my mind away. And so we eliminated that day one. So we pulled in the school system, judges, prosecutors, probation, parole, the faith-based community, nonprofit sector, mothers who had lost children to gun violence, youth, former gang members and drivers of violence themselves. And we pulled all of them into a 3-day, 4 to 5 to 6 hour long days of strategic planning, getting feedback from those who are on the front lines who have experienced this cycle of violence. And once we got that information and that feedback, we plugged that into some of the evidence-based stuff that we saw that was working across the country, primarily the CURE, the Community Violence Intervention Model. And so there was a strategy within that model called PEER, which is an acronym for Prevention, Intervention, Enforcement, and Reentry. And we felt that if we could take this feedback that we got from all of these different sectors and we plugged them into this model, this could be the strategy, not just for the immediate, but moving forward. And so if I could, I want to give you just some brief numbers to kind of give you an idea and context of where we are currently in comparison to last year and the 5-year average. And then I would just like to take a little bit of time to talk about some, and I stress just some, of the work that we are doing through each element of the PEER model, and then I can open it up for questions. And so last year at this time, Lexington had 24 homicides, 19 of which were gun-related. So far this year, we've had 9 homicides. This time last year, we were approaching 60 non-fatal shootings in Lexington. Right now, we're just over 30. And obviously, this isn't something we celebrate because there are still people that have lost their lives. But we do think that the work that we are doing with our community partners is making a difference and making an impact. And I think there's some things that we are doing that could be replicated in other spaces, and maybe not the work itself, but the way that we went about creating it. And so I'm going to go through just a couple of highlights of things that we're doing in each element of the peer model. And if you need to stop me, because I'm a hip-hop artist by trade, so I get the flowing. So you can stop me and slow me down, and we can answer any questions that you have. What y'all laughing for? So through prevention, the way that we characterize prevention is how do we stop gun violence before it happens? And obviously the biggest part of that, which could be a whole 30-minute session in itself, is going deep into the root causes that lead to gun violence. And obviously through our research, but then it's also been confirmed through some of our programming, are the very things that people were protesting about in 2020. When you talk about systemic racism and redlining and gentrification, when you talk about food insecurity, the metronome of everything that we are doing right now seems to be mental health and trauma. When we talk about the destruction of the family structure, these are all some of the root causes that lead to the gun violence that we are seeing. So some of the ways that we are attacking that is through our It Takes a Village mentoring program. We work currently with 12 different schools within the Fayette County school system. We work directly with the Friskies. Those Friskies identify 15 to 20 students who have either been directly impacted by gun violence, already engaged in some type of conflict, or are suffering from some of those root causes that we mentioned before. And then we come in with our community partners and we engage in a weekly mentoring session. And I lean on weekly because anything less than weekly is just a photo op that makes people feel good. These kids, our most underserved kids, need consistency. And sometimes we have to fight. I wish we could get in there 2 or 3 times a week, right? But they still got to go to class. And so weekly we come in and we focus on things that teachers just don't have time to focus on because their mandate is to teach our kids. So we come in and talk about substance use disorder. We come in and talk about mental health and trauma with a trauma-informed care approach. We talk about conflict resolution. We're talking about the difference between what these rappers are talking about in drill music and the reality. We're talking about social media, money management. And we're plugging in the gaps, and we're partnering with our school system to talk about the things that they might not have time to cover. And then that translates into our summer program, which we extend into 2 days a week for a full day. And we not only still focus on some of these skill building things, but then we also we have some fun and we kick it, right? I'm a little too old to be going to Sky Zone, but that's just part of the program sometimes. And so the mentoring allows us to start pulling layers back. What I found in this work is that you can't serve youth without serving the family, because you can have them for a day, you can have them for a few hours, but they have to go right back into conditions that leave them susceptible to different things. So we have to go into the homes and figure out what are ways that we can provide wraparound services for the families and support those families. Another thing that we do from the prevention side is our One Lexington grant program, which is putting money directly into the hands of those who are already on the ground doing the work. Lord knows, and I come from a grassroots background, literally in the streets doing the work. And we don't need government controlling every single program. We have amazing organizations in Lexington who have been doing this work for years, well vetted, already connected to the community. And so our job is, how do we get these resources into their hands so they can continue to do the great work, but then also amplify them, right? There's a lot of organizations that have been operating for 2 decades that don't even know what a 501c3 is, right? But they're doing great work. They don't know how to access resources. So how do we help them build their capacity? Help them to get their 501c3, help them to build their board so they can access other funding opportunities. And so that is something that One Lexington is really focused on, moving from a programmatic space more into a facilitator, amplifying others. And so, unfortunately, as I move into intervention, this is where the majority of our time and resources have been spent in 2020, 2021, and 2022, and that is intervention. That is how we're responding once gun violence has already happened. And there's been a lot of gun violence post-pandemic. And so one thing that we pulled, I think San Francisco is doing it, Newark is doing it, Philadelphia is doing it. One thing that we learned early on was our weekly violence intervention team meetings. When I first started with One Lexington and an incident of gun violence happens, right? It could be a fatal shooting, a house gets shot up. I found myself on the phone, sending emails, reaching out to people through a 48-hour period that felt like I was chasing my tail, searching for resources, trying to get answers, trying to get context. And by the time you got a hold of this person was unavailable. Then you get this person's on vacation, right? But in our work, seconds, a life could be gone. And a lot of what we see is retaliatory. So I don't have 48 hours to chase my tail. So these violence intervention team meetings consist of, and it's a running meeting every week, it consists of the police department, a couple of nonprofit organizations who do street outreach, Fayette County Public Schools, and a couple other community partners. We meet every Wednesday, and UK Trauma Center, which is a huge partner, right? They're literally the front line, right, in the first line of defense when a gunshot victim comes into the trauma room, right? And so we all get on the Zoom every week and we discuss the incidents from the week prior or the days prior. And now in real time, instead of us chasing our tail, we're able to get these resources, connect resources in real time on this call. And so that has been huge. Out of that weekly meeting comes the work that Kenneth does a great job in leading our crisis response. And our crisis response is how are we as a city responding to gun violence incidents? And a lot of cities only focus on fatal shootings, but we focus on non-fatal, but then we also focus on non-injury shootings. Because when a house gets shot up and there's a 5-year-old laying in the bed asleep that's awoken by gunfire and the bullets this close from their head, it may not make the news because nobody was hit, but that child is suffering from trauma. So we have to also respond to that child. And so Kenneth deploys one of our 4 crisis outreach workers who have a unique connection to individual pockets of the city. And so just to give you one example, because I know we're short on time, Pastor Nestor Gomez is one of our outreach advocates. He's a Latino pastor that lives in the Cardinal Valley area. For those not familiar with Lexington, Cardinal Valley has a huge Latino population. And what I noticed is there was a huge culture gap. There was that language barrier. There was that distrust between that community and government. And so there were a lot of resources that we wanted to give to this community who was being impacted by gun violence, but we couldn't get the resources to them because of that disconnect. And so Nestor, who lives in that area, was born in Mexico, now pastors a church in the area, has a unique understanding of that community. He is now our outreach advocate for Cardinal Valley. And now for the first time that I can really remember, this community is getting the resources and support when it comes to gun violence that is happening within their community. And so there's a lot of other things that we do on the intervention front, but I do want to skip to one thing because I think it is important to mention, and this could go in prevention or intervention, but that is our youth mediation. Because of our relationship with the school system, whenever 2 students engage in a conflict in school, and the school feels this is something that could spill out into the street, into the neighborhood, and can become more serious, they reach out to One Lexington. We deploy our staff or our community partners, and we come in and we mediate that conflict. And 9 times out of 10, if there hadn't been a death involved in this conflict, we are able to mediate that. And these are young people who are talking about it's on site. When I see you outside of school, it's going down. And so we come in, we pull not just the youth, but we pull the family together. We pull in those with the lived experience who have connections with these young people. And you'll see the common thread through everything we do is all about partnerships. And we come in and we mediate those conflicts. And so that's just, again, just a snapshot of some of the stuff that our community partners are doing through intervention. I can move through the next element of peer pretty quickly because we don't have any enforcement capabilities. But the E is for enforcement, and that is for our partners and friends in public safety, obviously. But one thing that we do focus on through One Lexington is how do we bridge the gap between law enforcement and underserved communities where it is generational distrust. When we go into some of these homes, we got 3-year-olds that are scared of police. How is that? It's because it is generational, right? From a young age. Maybe some of the things they've even experienced within their neighborhoods. So we are working, bringing in officers into our mentoring program so our kids can see them not just when arrests are being made, but they can see them as an ally, maybe a partner. But then also the police department, they have an onus. They have a part to play in this. And I believe our mayor's done a great job in providing more funding for neighborhood resource officers. These are officers with a unique connection to a specific part of the city. So they're out there going door to door. They're engaging with these young people so that these communities aren't only seeing law enforcement when arrests are being made. And so I believe One Lexington's part in enforcement is just helping to continue to bridge that gap. And then the final part of that peer model is probably was our biggest gap, I would say, last year, and that is reentry work. How are we supporting individuals who are coming home from incarceration? They come home, they can't get a job, they get minimal reentry at best, they can't vote, and so a lot of them feel hopeless and they go right back into the life that led them to where they are in the first place. How can we support those individuals more? And I believe the city is doing great. It has got a workforce development program. Tiffany is doing a great job with expungement clinics through her role in the mayor's office. We're working with Goodwill Ignite, which specifically provides second chance opportunities for young people who are coming out of the system. And so Jubilee Jobs, there's a lot of great organizations focused on reentry work. I would love to see there be a little bit more collaboration, and I think the city is leading in that effort. But I want to say this before I conclude, because I think this is another part of that. Reentry just isn't supporting those coming home, but what we are finding out in Lexington is we have judges there who, per their data and research, believe that locking children up and throwing away the key is not the answer to a safer community. And I can't really be mad at that, right? But on the same token, in our work, we're realizing that a lack of accountability is hurting us because there's nothing on the other end. There's not that brick wall on the other end to help us when it comes to engaging the most vulnerable youth. So what do? And so I believe that's an opportunity for the community and our community partners and even Frankfurt to help to create more alternative sentencing programs for the judges to utilize. So, okay, you may feel locking them up and throwing away the key isn't the answer, but giving them a slap on the wrist isn't the answer either. And so our judges in Lexington have done a great job utilizing alternative sentencing programs like OMAC, like the Voyage Movement, like MAID, that still provide that accountability, but in a different way. And so, again, that is just some of the work that we have been blessed to do through One Lexington. The common theme is strengthening peer support and utilizing partnerships to make it all happen and make it all work. And I wrote down just a couple things. I feel like our partnership opportunities between local government and Frankfurt. But as I'm looking at the time, I want to be respectful. And so maybe I can get to these. But I like to open it up to questions.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the presentation, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
And then we'll open it up to any other questions that the members may have.
Yeah.
Overarching question. There are some things government can do and some things government can't do. This is a question that's specifically targeted towards what government can do. What do the youth of Kentucky most need, in your opinion, whether it's in our urban and bigger city environments or in a rural environment?
Yeah. I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. I think the biggest thing is trauma-informed care approaches and access to affordable mental health.
Okay.
Every sector that we get into, even through my own nonprofit work, I do a lot of work in Eastern Kentucky, and they dealing with some of the same issues in the hollers that the kids that we work with every day in the hood is dealing with, and I think that mental health access is something that all of our kids need.
Thank you for that. You mentioned the weekly gun violence intervention team, and I know you named UK. You named a couple of partners. Who, and just by category, who's on that team?
Sure. So we try to think of what are resources that we would need to respond to an incident, and usually we need context of those involved, possibly the victims, right? Victims or the perpetrator. And so we usually have a prosecutor on who can give us some context. We need what was the tone? What was going on when the victim came into the hospital? We need that context to help us understand is retaliatory violence imminent. UK Trauma Center and their team is usually on the call. Because of our age purview, 13 to 29, we usually get incidences that involve juveniles, and so the school system is also on the call. So a lot of times they send out support of their own, but then they can also give us added context. What were you going to say, Larry?
I was just adding that the school system, we have both school system law enforcement as well as the Friskies office as well as administration. They help us with providing handle with care to those students and to those around them. We have also the Lexington Rescue Mission, who is one of our community partners, who help provide resources such as street outreach, supports such as temporary housing and things like that. Sometimes we need people to move from their community and stay in temporary housing or relocation.
My last question, Chairman, and you just hit on it again. You mentioned that a lot of the instances, and by the way, I'm grateful that you're not looking at only the fatalities. I think you're absolutely right. The cases that aren't ended up in the news, there's still trauma there. There's still harm. There's still fear. There's still things that need to be responded to. You said that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, maybe you said most, maybe you said a lot, but they're retaliatory in nature, these incidents of gun violence. You did mention a school response and that you all are called into the schools, but before you said that, my question was, how in the world do you combat that? How do you get people to cool off so that the first response isn't a retaliatory response? And that is where a lot of the root causes come into play. I think most of the kids that we work with, I would say about 90% have already been directly impacted by gun violence. And so mental health, focusing on the untreated trauma is a huge part of it. Mentoring is a huge part of it. I think 85% of our in-school mentoring program participants this year didn't have a father in the home. Yeah. So I think that that is a huge part of it, filling the gap in with mentors. But then there's a cultural aspect to this. When we talk about the music, we talk about social media. And then for us, I'll be honest, and I know I'm probably one of the least political people you'll ever meet. So when I say this, I speak strictly from being in the street doing this work on a weekly basis. The amount of firearms that are in possession of juveniles, sometimes I wonder if we're chasing our tail. Like their access. I had a 14-year-old tell me once, Mr. Devine, it's easier for me to get a gun than to get a job. And that, it really shocked me. And it brought me back to, and I'll be really quick, I'm a father of girls. And so my oldest daughter is 21. I have another daughter that would have turned 22 this year. She passed in 2020. But as a girl dad, I remember telling my daughters, your body is your temple. Wait till you're married. You know, guys only want one thing, right? Giving that little speech, hoping that they would save it. But then I remember in their teenage years reaching a point where something had changed. And Dad had to look in the mirror and change his message. I had to read the writing on the wall and realize, okay, it's time for me to stop telling them to wait until they get married, and now I need to tell them to protect themselves.
And that was a hard conversation as a dad to have with himself, right? I believe we are at a unique place now, and I don't know what that conversation looks like when it comes to firearms, right? It's different what we are seeing in the streets right now. And I realize it may be different depending on where you are in Kentucky, but in Lexington, what we are seeing is you wouldn't believe it. It's unfathomable, the access that they have to high-powered firearms and how many are in possession. I've had firearms going off as I'm out doing engagement walks. I've seen youth on a regular basis brandishing, open, carrying firearms. And so I don't know what that conversation looks like, but that is definitely a huge reality.
If I may add, I would like to definitely emphasize the value of building relationships with communities and with families.
Yeah.
And after there's a shooting, and Kenneth can talk more about that, we have a crisis response team that actually goes into that community, not just to the house that may have been involved in the incident, but we build those relationships with the community. We go up and down the streets after a shooting right in that community, building relationships. So those relationships, if we can't reach the persons who are involved, maybe the community person can.
That's right.
Our mayor has made a concerted effort of meeting with the mothers of victims. Sometimes these mothers have children who have been involved in one way or another sometime. And by building those relationships, we are able to have an influence as well. So I just wanted to mention those things. Kenneth can talk more about what this crisis response team does, but I think it is important that we build relationships with communities and with families, because those we can't reach, they can.
That's right.
Thank you all.
Representative Cole Carney, you're next for addressing our presenters.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for presenting today. This was a lot of really good information, and I appreciate the work that you've done in creating a model that sounds very strategic and very inclusive in terms of partnerships, as well as all the communities that are potentially impacted. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more on the youth mediation piece. I think you mentioned it, and I know there's some explanation in our materials, but specifically with regard to who is involved in the mediation. I know you've listed that you have crisis response advocates.
Yeah.
So if you could just speak a little bit more towards who actually is involved in the mediation, and then how effective you've seen the mediation be or anticipated to be in all the goals that you've outlined for us today.
Sure. So our crisis response advocates that we mentioned as part of our crisis response whenever there's a shooting, those are usually the same individuals that we use for our youth mediation. And our mediators, and we got about 4 or 5 other mediators that are community partners that are part of that collective, and all of them have been trained by Green Dot through bystander awareness training. We are in the process of scheduling the training with Dr. Woods out of Louisville for violence disruption, trauma-informed care training, conflict resolution training. And so usually it looks like this. The school will call us, and we usually bring, obviously, the 2 students together, but we bring the families together. Usually the admin at the school and usually the resource officer at the school focuses on the families. They kind of talk about what's been going on. Unfortunately, a lot of the parents that are part of the mediations we've been a part of aren't regularly involved or as tapped in as far as what their kids are doing in school. And so this creates an opportunity to get in a parent-teacher conference to kind of give them the full scope of what's going on with their child. Usually we choose a community partner or a crisis response advocate that has a unique connection either to that child or the neighborhood that child lives in. Mr. Larry said it perfectly. It's all about relationships, especially when you ask, how do we get in their minds and hearts? How do we mediate and stop some of this stuff from happening? It's all about relationships. There's a lot of kids that I can reach, but there's some kids, my time in the street wasn't long. It wasn't extensive. I put in a little work, but not a lot. We got some brothers who did 10, 15 years in prison, were ex-gang members. And sometimes you need somebody with that level of lived experience to come in and speak to some of these kids because their message is going to resonate. Sometimes you need somebody who's never been involved in anything that can come in and also show that kid that there's another pathway. And so for us, it's all about relationships once we get in. And we've been very successful with our mediations. And we usually follow up for about 6 months. And so I think the hardest part is when a homicide happens. When one of these young people lose a loved one or a friend, that's when it's really hard to mediate a conflict. So the earlier we can get to it, the better our chances are.
Representative Herron.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. It's so great to see you both, Divine and Larry. I've had an opportunity to work with them in the past, so it's great to see you all doing the work. I am very impressed by the work that Lexington, One Lex, has been doing. I have been able to follow that work, and I think it is great. One of the things that I have proposed here at the state level is to create an Office of Safe Communities, and it sounds very similar to what you all are doing in Lexington. Yeah. But I believe that if we were to create an office such as that here, it would be able to help local jurisdictions like Lexington and Louisville and other places with resources, that capacity building that you're talking about. Yeah. And I know that you said that you did have some things that the state could assist with. So I have two questions. Can you talk a little bit deeper about what exactly it is that you all need from us at the state level? And then you also talked about a trauma-informed care. Are you all doing any type of healing work as well? Because obviously our young people, as you talked about, a kid there may be a drive-by at somebody's house. Somebody is not deceased, but they may not got shot. They may just be in that area. But what does the healing aspect of your all's work look like? And then can you talk more about what you all have been seeing in Eastern Kentucky?
Sure. So two things to kind of start there and then move backwards. And good to see you as well. We are working. Trauma has just been, it's just at the forefront of everything we're dealing with these young people. And it's not just providing the space for them to get that healing, but you're also talking about pockets of our community who generationally don't even acknowledge the need for healing. Whether it's because systematically they've been disenfranchised from those opportunities, or it is just something generationally that didn't exist. Even having conversations with my mother now, I'm realizing that she endured things that she shouldn't have endured, but she was taught to deal with it and move on. And I'm like, no, Mom, like you didn't have to deal with that. And that is passed down through generations. So we're also trying to break the stigma of mental health and trauma support, especially within the Black community. So it starts there before we can even create the space. Once we do that successfully, I know right now we have two different organizations that we're working with our kids in our summer youth program. Now, the majority of our kids are kids of color. One of the main things that we hear from young people and their parents when it comes to mental health practitioners, I want somebody that looks like me, understands what I'm going through, right? And so we really struggle finding mental health practitioners of color. But God is good. And we found two that we are working with on a regular basis. One is Trauma Informed Care Counseling Center of Lexington, and one is Andrews Brothers Counseling Center, which is actually three brothers. And so they're coming into our summer program once a week and doing a trauma-informed care, almost kind of support group where the kids can openly talk about their experiences with gun violence and some other things. But then also, depending on what they share in these closed sessions, these organizations that we work with create opportunities for families to access more extensive therapy and counseling for these students that need it. And so we're really breaking down walls when it comes to that. Some of the things to answer your second question, I'm going backwards, some things that we jotted down, and we're really big in not putting ourselves in the middle of these solutions, but really listening to folks. So this isn't necessarily Divine Karama saying this, but these are some of the things that we found talking to people. One thing that several neighborhood associations mention is the taxes on the shelters, the neighborhood shelters, which I think is part of a bigger tax structure that started this year, and it's actually taxing the neighborhood shelters and anything that is being sold, like a fish fry, from the neighborhood shelter. And it's making it hard for them to do their community engagement events. And we rely heavily from a preventative side on our community partners doing this type of work. And so that is something several neighborhood associations have brought up. I didn't even know anything about it, but they have mentioned that. Victim services is a huge part of our work, right, Larry? Absolutely. We are allocating quite a bit of funding to support families who have lost loved ones to gun violence. And that might be temporary housing because they're being targeted. That might be relocation. That might be helping a mother who just lost her son to gun violence and fell out of work. Now she's lost her job, and we're coming in helping her with rent and bills. It might be funeral expenses. It might be mental health resources. And so victim services is definitely something possibly Frankfurt could help with. Obviously, more grant funding for grassroots organizations. I think one unique thing we did with ours is obviously most grant opportunities are for 501c3 organizations. But what about those grassroots organizations who have kind of systemically been left out of the know-how, don't know what a 501c3 is, but they're doing life-changing work? We allow them to access a fiscal sponsor, and they can apply through someone who does have their 501c3 and still get a grant with us. If more opportunities existed from the state level like that, and we get more money into the organizations doing the work, I think that would be great. Something that Dr. Sine Adams with Fayette County Public Schools mentioned is having a mental health collective that families could choose from, maybe one that is state or city or locally paid for to a certain dollar amount, to where families who don't have health care or families who can't access or afford mental health, they can go to this collective, get the mental health resources they need, and the state pays for that. And then obviously the last thing, and again, it's y'all's job. You know, I don't know how to go about this, but there are a lot of guns on the street. Just easy access. And so obviously that is nothing we can do on the local level, but it is something we are hitting the face with every day. And youth jobs.
I would like to add one more when you asked about healing. We at our village conference trained, I think it was about 150 community stakeholders, representatives in mindfulness. We felt like it's very important for them to deal with self-care because they're on the front line, as well as to be able to teach the young people that they're involved in how to stop, be still, become mindful of what's going on, and to have better decision-making skills. Another thing we're doing is we understand that a lot of these young people have lost relatives, not just to gun violence, but to COVID, relatives to sickness and disease and other things, as well as gun violence. And it's and in many cases, they have unaddressed grief and grieving issues. And so when it comes to healing, we bring in and we promote grieving sessions and tactics. So that's very important with us when it comes to the healing aspect that you question us about. Those are things that we do.
Representative Herron, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you all for answering those questions and for your work, and I will make sure that I do the best that I can here to get our colleagues to put some money and resources and come up with some solutions that we at the state level can help you all in Lexington as well as folks in Louisville and across the state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Brown, you're recognized next. Representative Hebron, you're on deck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One Lex team, thank you all so much for what you do. My question and a comment to you all is to talk about what the state can do for One Lex and the efforts that you all are putting forward. Something that I found out when I came to Frankfurt as a legislator is that the ideas for legislation does not necessarily come from our heads, but it comes from people like you that are out there in the community doing the work. So talk to me, talk to us, and let us be your champion, if you will, to carry legislation forward. So I would ask that of you. I think that the peer concept, and this is the first time that I've seen you all and worked with Larry for years and years and years, and Divine, we've been hitting and missing each other. Yeah. And I'm a subject of a drive-by. That when the street lights come on in my neighborhood, I go upstairs now. So it is certainly something that we need to take care of and understand. I think there are two things that I would like for you to address, and you did superficially, but employment for young people, and also reentry, and I think also job training, or training, because a lot of young people tell me, well, I can't get a job, nobody will hire me, and I ask them several questions. Can you fix something? Can you make something? Can you build something? So if we can give folk a trade, a lot of our young people that are out there in the underground economy is what I call it, out there in the underground economy, if they could do something else, I think they would possibly do something else. Some of them are not going to change. Some of them are going to stay in the areas that they're in. But speak to how we can move them from where they are to a different space and a different place in our society, to be contributing members of society as well.
Well, I'll speak to this specifically, and not to be, redundant, but on what we spoke on earlier. But one thing I've noticed, and again, I'm, not trying to be corny or nothing, but like it's all about partnerships, because I think what's working at Lexington is we're constantly in touch. We're working together so much that we're adopting the same language. Therefore, the expectations are the same for all of these young people, regardless of where they go. Whether they come into UK trauma suffering from a gunshot, whether they are speaking to a judge and a prosecutor, whether they come into one of these alternative programs or they go to the school system, we are all using the same language and we have the same expectation. Therefore, they are not falling through the gaps. And so even when I look at some of the struggles we've had in employers hiring young people, they talk about them not being workforce ready, from their temperament, from their commitment, to their manners. Those are things that our mentors focus on in our mentoring groups. So even though these employers and OMAC aren't working directly together, what is being instilled in OMAC is going to make them workforce ready when they go to these employers. And so I think those constant conversations that these cross-sector organizations are having has been huge. And I think that needs to continue. And even speaking to your opening of, we just need to have more open communication with you all, just so we can let you know what we're getting from the people, because your sentiment to us is our sentiment to the people that we serve. We're not here for us. We are giving you what the people are giving us. And so I believe that these kind of conversations is how we make sure people don't fall through the cracks.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Brown, can I add one?
Yes.
One of the things that I'm hearing is the need for younger people to be able to work, to be in positions and to be mentored in those environments. We focus largely on, and I know Tyler's sitting here with us, our high schoolers. But those younger people are left to, at a younger age in junior high, to develop habits and to be introduced to negative elements that they wouldn't be vulnerable to if they could work as well. So we have that limit of hours if they can work where it's not productive, and we have them left to their own devices because of their age. And we're hearing it everywhere in the community, over and over. You have to address those younger people. You have to give them more positive, structured activities, not just to make money, but because it puts them in touch with adults who are positive, that's mentorship, that's structured environments, that's also income the family needs, as well as building character. So I'm not sure where legislation falls in with being able to engage middle schoolers and people at a much younger age, but that's vitally important, and that's one thing we're hearing from the community.
Excuse, Mr. Chair, just one.
Please proceed.
The last point in your peer model,
Yeah.
reentry is critical and important. That I think it's important for us to have reentry programs for those people who have been incarcerated, served their time, and then are coming out, and the opportunities for them are very small. So I'd like to see us be involved in that reentry piece as well.
We have Tyler Scott here, Mayor's Chief of Staff, and he's going to speak to a program that talks exactly what you're talking about.
I'm sharing the details a little bit prematurely, but I think the mayor would be pretty excited to know this we're talking about today. We are actually rethinking the way we do some of our workforce development exactly the way we're talking. We're reengaging our private sector in looking at Lexington right now. We're at record low unemployment. We have very few pockets of the population left to go to. And we're using that as an opportunity to talk about reentry and giving former felons another chance. So what we're getting ready to launch with a large amount of our typical workforce development funding is our Second Chance Academy. And the way we've crafted this is we've contracted with Juvenile Jobs, who typically runs a fantastic workforce program. You show up at their door at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. You need to learn how to write a resume. You need some kind of entry-level skill that matches up with sectors in our community who are looking for jobs, and they work you through. What we did was sit down with them and say, can you dial that back? Can you go into our jails and start this program? We'll help you identify those who are ready 90, 60, 30 days out. Can you start there and having them connected to employment the day they leave? And so we're looking at starting that next month. It's a new program that we've never tried before, but we thought it's an opportunity we wouldn't want to miss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. Representative Hebron.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all. I am refreshed by your enthusiasm. As you all talk about this, you can tell it radiates from each of you all. So thank you all for coming here to talk to us. Much like you all, I think a lot of the conversation here with the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity came after the summer of 2020. And so I appreciate you all putting, I want to say your money where your mouth is, but it's true, you're investing in your community. And I think that is so important. And I really appreciated how you talked about bringing in community partners. I think that is so important, and especially bringing in former gang members. You know, that's not usually when you're talking about community partners, that's not the first person you think of. But it's true because we've got to figure out how we get kids off the street. I really appreciated you talking. The gentleman at the end in the orange tie. I'm sorry. I did not hear your name.
Larry Johnson.
Larry. I was at a conference last week, and I was talking about how I wish we had more after-school programs for kids because I think it would really be a barrier. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I don't know if I appreciate you echoing what I say or me echoing what you say, but I do think it's really important that we're talking about after-school community programs because kids need structure. Just as adults, we need structure. I think a lot of us saw that during COVID. Kids need structure and consistency, and you pointed that out. You also mentioned the rural-urban divide, and I appreciate that because that is something, you know, here in Frankfurt we talk about how Republicans and Democrats are a big divide, but really it's not. It's the rural versus urban, and there are very few of us legislators here who actually understand how important, you know, I'm a rural legislator, but I understand the importance of our urban communities. And there are very few urban legislators who recognize the importance of the rural communities. And I think that divide there is important because we've said this from the very beginning of this commission, was that we don't know the difference between Appalachia and the west end of Louisville or Lexington because it all goes back to it's the lack of access to opportunity for the people that live there. And so I wanted to ask what we could do in our own community to address root causes. But the more you spoke, I think you answered that question. And so I want to leave you with this. What do you feel like your biggest hurdle to success is with this? I think conversations like this can make a lot of people feel uncomfortable if you're not ready to have those conversations. But other than money, if you had a magic wand and you could remove any barrier that you all face to make sure that this is a successful program in Lexington and other places. I've been texting Representative Heron, I'm like, is this going on in Louisville? Like, we need this. But I would like to know what do you think your biggest hurdle to success is?
before
That's not money because everyone asks for money around here.
right. Before Divine jumps in, I'll say, I think a lot of times communities and many people don't understand that this work isn't something that's going to happen overnight. I know you mentioned magic wand. A lot of times when people see us in these positions, they see you all in you all's positions, they think you have a magic wand. And you being behind the scenes, you know it's not a magic wand. So that mentality that we're in this for the long haul. I'm the new kid on the block. Here with One Lexington. I started in December. But prior to that, I spent about 6 years in a group home, supervised there. And then after that, spent about 10 years as a state social worker. So I've worked with this population for several years, going on 17 years. And I understand that a lot of times it's not going to happen overnight. I had a kid reach out to me about 2 years ago that I worked with 12 years ago, talking about some of the things that was instilled at that time that is just now coming to fruition. So I think one of the things is just that messaging and the education of this is not overnight. As Divine said, when they did the strategic plan, they did that with the mentality of how can we ensure that in 5 years we're not back here. I think a lot of times we see a lot of buzzwords are being used, and then, you know, we kind of go on and use that and it's hot and it's popular, and then 5-10 years later it's another buzzword. But if you look underneath all that, it's still the same root causes that are happening, that are the reason why, you know, some of these buzzwords are popular. So in my opinion, I think it's that education piece to the community and others, and even some in, you know, government city, because a lot of times they're looking at us like, okay, what y'all gonna do? We got these numbers. They're looking at numbers, as Divine gave numbers earlier. We don't look at numbers. We don't celebrate numbers, but we do understand that numbers, you know, kind of tell the story. But just the education piece of knowing that we're in this for the long haul. Maybe I won't see it in my lifetime, but I know that the work that I'm doing will have an effect, a long-term effect. So that would be my kind of opinion.
Last question is going to be Senator Webb, unless Brandon. Yes, so Senator Webb, you're up, and Representative Timoney, you're going to have the last question before I conclude this panel. So, Senator Webb.
Thank you. Just briefly, I just sometimes the task forces and the overlap, and jail reform is on one that we're working on now. And I just asked Tyler to keep us informed on that program. It's already been mentioned on urban-rural divide. You know, in East Kentucky, we don't have the programmatic opportunities that other or more urban areas do. And certainly I think that's a discussion we had last week about how to bring parity. You know, we've got state prisoners that we're responsible for in these county jails, and if we can implement a consistent opportunity across the board, regardless of where you are or where you've been assigned or where you happen to commit a crime, you don't let that prejudice your opportunity. And I think, Tyler, I would be interested in the data from that program and how, because that's a kind of a low-cost opportunity to implement, and the cooperations. And as we look at our jails, which is, you know, a generational problem that we're dealing with here with juveniles, it does overlap. So I appreciate what the mayor's doing there, and would appreciate maybe keeping us on the success of that program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Timoney.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, committee, today. Obviously, you know, I've had a front and center view of the work that you all have done, and in the One Lex previously. As assistant principal at Winburn Middle School, I got to see a lot of the work, you know, the Winburn Beautification Project and that type of stuff. That was something I was pretty closely attached to, and the students that I got to work with there. I'll go ahead and tell you, as an assistant principal, where I invested countless minutes with individuals only to see them be murdered or commit murder. You know, you start wondering if I'd spent that time doing something different, had the outcome been different. It's incredibly frustrating. I was there for 6 years, and I can't tell you, I lost count at 10 who've either been murdered or are in prison for murder. And it wasn't that long ago. I saw a mom recently of a student who had been murdered a few years back. So this is front and center for me, and I pay attention to this, and I read the news, and I pay attention to this particular topic. Obviously, because I also know how it translates into the success of schools. So I saw some amazing work at Winburn Middle School, but by all accounts and purposes, it's a failing school by all the metrics that are being discussed for that. So this is something that definitely fits there. I looked at I've got a couple of brief comments, and I've got a question at the very end, and it's going to be a heavy one. All right. So I noticed the schools that you're working with. You know, I'm a big believer in, we passed some legislation this past session to help protect some of our students that are part of the transient population moving from school district to school district. So if you're moving from Center Parkway, you're moving over to Hollow Creek. If you're moving from, Winburn Middle School, you're going to Taste Creek Middle, and this and that. So I understand how we're doing that. So that pyramid of interventions is, Bryan Station High School is missing, and I definitely see a need there. Okay, it wasn't on the power. So, okay, we made a comment about middle school kids, 100%. That is where I was a high school teacher for 15 years before I went to middle education. Middle is where kids are choosing the path that they're going to take. When they're in high school, it's more of the identity, what it looks like. But middle school is definitely where there's a lot of work.
And could I say
to be done.
this just to add to that? Honestly, as we're kind of out of crisis mode and really looking at prevention, because of technology, because of advancement, really third, fourth grade, these kids, what they have access to, what they're already doing, are things we weren't even thinking of until we were in 8th grade, maybe 9th grade.
Sure.
So we're even thinking of really trying to go younger if you truly want to be preventative. Yeah.
Well, and I think that fits in with the feeder pattern kind of mindset that I was, if we're addressing it through those feeder patterns, because I know that Fayette County's got a pretty clear one, but again, your populations are going to be changing, or your adjusters are going to be changing, so there's definitely some work there. The persistence to graduation report is a report that all the Friskies and school counselors have access to. It's what I used, and basically it's a report that's got all the factors involved. If there's been trauma involved, if the kids are on track to graduate, even if they're in 5th and 6th grade, they're on this report. It's a really, really important report. And I guarantee you every student that I have lost in the system was on that report. So there's a data point, there's a database out there, and not every kid is going to be on there, is going to end up in a bad situation, but they're on that list, so there's at least a common theme there. And I think that there's a lot of validity there as far as a collaboration between your work and the school system having working together with that list. I think that list is really important because it quantifies it, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for data to help narrow it down. It takes a village, but sadly, the village is not paying attention. They're saying that's some other kid's problem. That's what I felt when I was reaching out to families. Hey, you got your neighbor down the street really need. No, that's their problem. That's their problem. That I'm staying in my lane. I'm keeping where I'm supposed to be. And the last thing, what do we do about the snitch culture? How many unsolved cases exist in Lexington because of the snitch culture?
Is that the heavy question?
That's the heavy question. What are we going to do about that? Because that's the culture piece. Yeah. And that's something we got to solve, because there are kids in graves that we don't know who pulled the trigger, but people know.
Yeah. Best way for me to explain that is, first of all, happy 50th birthday to hip-hop culture. I would not be here today if it wasn't for hip-hop, which originally was created to be a voice for the voiceless. One thing that me and the mayor joke about, as a hip-hop artist, I make clean music now, but I didn't used to, right? But she'll come to me and she'll say, Divine, I love your hip-hop music because it's clean. And I always joke with her and say, if you want clean music, you have to go to the communities in which the music comes from, and you have to clean up those communities. So when it comes to snitch culture, it's difficult because it is part of an environment that they come from. So it isn't as easy as saying, hey, this snitch culture is leading to XYZ, you literally have to go to the roots of why that is embedded in certain communities. And there's a legit fear factor. It's not just a trendy thing to say I'm not a snitch, but we've also had young people who have lost their lives. And so I think there's an education piece around what snitching is, because a lot of these kids don't know the difference between being a snitch and being a witness. And being a snitch is street culture. If you are not in the street, then you do not have to uphold street etiquette. And so it's those educational pieces that we try to have. But ultimately, we're trying to keep young people from even entering in a cycle or a space where they have to adhere to the no snitching culture. So I don't know if the no snitching thing is something we can stop, but we can surely keep young people from feeling like they got to be in a environment or a situation that makes them feel like they got to decide whether snitching is a thing or not, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Can I add one thing to that real quick? When we started this program and launched it this way, we had very intentional conversations about how we from the mayor's office would empower them and support them, and how critical the trust between their work and law enforcement in particular was. Behind the scenes, it had to be seamless. We had to have trust going both ways. I spent a lot of days and nights making sure that trust was always there. But from the outside, it had to look like there was daylight. They couldn't look like an extension of law enforcement. We've seen this in cities all across the country. Street outreach workers in Baltimore, 3 gunned down last year. So they can't be seen as the snitches either. This makes this work so complicated. But they have to have a trust level with known shooters, people involved who've witnessed crimes, and if they feel they can comfortably get it to law enforcement that furthers the investigation, great, but they can't do it in a way that puts their own lives on the line. That's where we've drawn a line on all this. So we work with our law enforcement. You've seen the number of flock cameras we've put up to try to hold people accountable, different types of I won't say surveillance technology we've used to assist in those kind of investigations, to take more of the pressure off of them, to not feel like they're caught in the middle in these kind of things, to make sure their names aren't circulated as those that are ratting out folks who try to share sensitive information with them. So I just put it out there as the many, many layers in all this that we have to work through every day.
So that was heavy.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it was just, that was heavy.
So to One Lexington and the mayor's office, we thank you very much for your presentation. As you conclude, before you leave the table,
thank you.
Let me just challenge you in this way. In less than an hour, about an hour's time, you've entered into a totally new relationship with a number of people. We're now engaged in partnership via your presentation. You've got a group of ambassadors up here that are going to be cheerleading, shouting, sharing your story, amplifying your message. Thank you for the work you do. And as you leave, I've picked up 3 specific charges that we're going to be working on based on the conversations here. Director Karama, we're going to have Brandon connect you with our revenue staff to get clarification on this event taxation and concession question. So you'll have some follow-up from Brandon specific to state law, what it is now, and if changes need to be made, or if there is some piece to the conversation that maybe your folks are missing that we can help clarify quickly.
Okay.
Mr. Johnson, we're going to investigate the question of employment of young people between ages of 12 and 16 plus or minus in some sort of a paid work program. Are there opportunities that we can work to facilitate your organization and others employing these young people and helping them find purpose and meaning? Maybe that's something we can do. Brandon will help follow up on that as well.
Thank you.
The last resource and thought that Brandon brought to my attention, I want to direct everyone to Jennifer Fletcher. Jennifer, if you'd stand for just a moment with KY Stats. Jennifer's a great resource in terms of stats across Kentucky, and so Jennifer may be connected to you through Brandon. Any information she may have or any insights that you can share with her. We need to bring people, like you're doing, we need to bring people in a room together and help them discover each other. So thank you for the presentation. Well done, and we look forward to your continued success.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda, I'm looking forward to a presentation by Kentucky Youth Advocates, Juvenile Justice System Disparities and Equity in Youth Diversion Programs. I invite Courtney and Shannon and any others that need to be part of the presentation come onto the table. As you both know from years of experience, turn your microphones on, introduce yourselves for the record, and we look forward to your presentation.
If I may, while they're getting settled, Chairman, I want to speak to something Representative Heverin said. I'm surprised that you were met with surprise by the idea that you floated in that conference with those other folks. I was at our Kentucky court system has a commission on mental health that I'm glad to be a part of. I think you may also be a part of that. Maybe not? Okay. There's like 85 people, and I just lose track of who's on it. But they had a summit a few weeks ago in Louisville. It was very well attended and had a lot of panels, a lot of different discussions, and I was honored to come to a panel that KYA put together, and it had 3 young adults who had been through the juvenile justice system. And one of the takeaways I got from that was similar to a panel of other young adults from New Mexico just last week. They're not from New Mexico. The presentation was in New Mexico. They're from Wichita, Kansas, and they said the exact same thing that the young adults said in Louisville, which is that it would have been really helpful if they had centers, places to go, to be mentored, to learn, to be occupied. The folks at Youth Build, I don't want to steal your thunder. That you may not have been talking about that, but I wanted to highlight this because of what you said. They said that over the last many years in Louisville, some of those have closed, and the opportunities for that have gone away, and that's in a place where there are a lot more resources than there are in rural Kentucky. I think that should be a budget focus for the Commonwealth. So I wanted to say that. I'm with you. House and Senate partnerships exist. Ladies, please.
First, we wanted to start off by thanking our the chairs of both committees, Senator Westerfield, Representative Elliott, Givens, and Timoney. I'm Shannon Moody with Kentucky Youth Advocates.
I'm Courtney Downs, also with Kentucky Youth Advocates.
We're going to take just a brief moment to talk about what Kentucky Youth Advocates is before we jump into the data. Courtney's going to be taking the lead on this, and I'm here as a support. We really appreciate you all focusing on this issue. We know that KYA has been working around juvenile justice since 1977 when we started. Our focus is around advocating for systemic change for all kids in Kentucky to make Kentucky the best place in America to be young. And we do that by bringing research and data to the table, as well as the voices of folks with lived experience. So Senator Westerfield had mentioned our Reform Louisville group. That is a group made up of young people who have juvenile justice experience, would probably love to talk to you all about their experience and their ideas. One of the major features of what they bring is being able to reflect on what went well and what didn't well while they were involved in the system. So appreciate your all's time, and I'm going to turn it over to Courtney.
All right. So I want to start first by just acknowledging the incredible work that's been done over the years with legislators, with the Administrative Office of the Courts, and also critical stakeholders as well, just around reforming the juvenile justice system, and then also thinking through new ways of how to best respond to kids when they get in trouble. There has been tremendous progress that has been made over quite a bit of time, but there are still some of those areas where the racial disparities exist, which is going to be the focus of today. So from what you all can see on this slide, for those who aren't as familiar with the terminology, complaints are basically the juvenile equivalent of adult police reports. And in Kentucky, kids of any age can have a complaint taken out on them by anyone for any offense. So when you look at the data, black youth and multiracial youth are complained on at 2 and 4 times their representation in the population respectively. And this racial breakdown, like what you're seeing right here, has been fairly consistent since about 2017. Black youth specifically kind of fluctuate between like the 24% and the 22%. You all also should have received some county level data as well that will kind of go through all of the complaint breakdowns. We'll also look at like diversion opportunities, whether those were successful or not, and then the number of kids who have been transferred to adult court. But when you look at the complaint trends just as they've, just over like the past 10 years, maybe even more than that, what we've seen is a steady decline in the total number of complaints. And a lot of that is due to juvenile justice reforms that have been implemented successfully. And so we've seen a lot of much fewer kids actually coming into the system. But again, those racial disparities are then kind of exacerbated a little bit, or have persisted, I should say. I think it's also important to flag that the numbers that you're seeing here are lower than the pre-COVID numbers that we've seen in 2019. And the data is mostly consistent across offenses. So public offenses, which are the misdemeanors and the felonies, and then also the status offenses as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about young children specifically, so like those that are 12 and under throughout this presentation. But they consistently make up about 7 to 9% of all of the complaints that we see.
Courtney, you might, for those that are not in the JJOC world,
yes,
explain the difference between a public offense and a status offense.
Yes, sorry. So,
and you might pull your mic up just a hair.
Sorry, thank you. Printing my notes off. Okay. So public offenses, those are misdemeanors, felonies, and when we talk about status offenses, those are offenses that are only considered problematic or illegal because of the person's age. So it's like running away from school, truancy, alcohol use. So those are the two. And then thinking back to just young kids specifically, so 12 and under, like I said, they make up about 7 to 9% of all of the complaints that we see statewide. 12-year-olds make up the biggest proportion of that at about 76%. Then you'll see 11-year-olds at about 20%, and the rest are under that age. I think the youngest complaint was maybe on a 9-year-old in the most recent data. Okay, so next we're going to look at these school-related versus non-school-related complaints. Typically, statewide, most complaints will originate from city police departments, so that can even include the school-related offenses, or that can be something that happens like at school or at a school-associated function. We see in this data, though, that Black and multiracial youth are most likely to receive a complaint outside of a school setting. And again, when you look at the numbers for younger kids, you'll see those disparities widen as well, with law enforcement and school personnel taking out the majority of the complaints on those kids. And data from 2019 out of Jefferson County showed that Black youth made up about 2/3 of all of the complaints that were filed on kids who were 12 and under. And also I can point out that the total number of complaints tends to spike in the spring and the fall when school is also in session. So when we talk about detention at intake, this refers to the kids who have been picked up or arrested by law enforcement, have met with the CDW, have typically been administered the detention screening instrument, which is a risk assessment tool, and then a call has been made to the on-call judge who will make a determination about whether a kid is going to be detained, whether they can be released on HIP, home incarceration, or whether they can just be released outright. So if a kid undergoes the risk assessment and they're found to be low risk, the judge still has the option of overriding that decision. So I'm going to talk a little bit about overrides later in the presentation, and that's just what at least part of it is referring to. So they can override the decision and have a child remain in detention until their initial court hearing. But as you can see on this graph, there is a clear overrepresentation of youth of color who are detained at intake, with Black youth being detained at a rate that's about 3 times their representation in the population. And most recent data that came out of Jefferson County found that about 30% of the kids who were detained out there had undergone that risk assessment. And so of that 30%, there were 70% of them that were detained because of an override. And Black and multiracial youth accounted for, I'm going to say, more than 40% of all of that override population and the kids who were detained because of it. So, okay, so moving on with disparity. So as I said at the beginning, I think Kentucky has done, just as a state, we have done a really fantastic job of offering diversion, of having kids successfully diverted. But again, we are still seeing those racial disparities, with Black youth making up only 16% of the complaints that are diverted and 30% of all of the complaints that are not. We see similar trends when you look at national data, and you also see these trends persisting regardless of the offense category. So it can be a violent offense, a property offense, or even a drug-related offense. The disparities continue to persist. And again, when we look at the diversion override decisions, Black youth accounted for about 23% of the county attorney overrides and 32% of the judicial overrides. And for those who may not be as familiar, Kentucky law does allow for kids to have their cases diverted. I believe it's up to 3 misdemeanor offenses or status offenses and then 1 felony offense, as long as it isn't a sex offense or there wasn't a deadly weapon that was used. And in the case of a felony offense, the county attorney will actually have to approve it in writing. And if the diversion isn't completed successfully, then there is still clearly that option that they would have to go through the formal court hearing. So I guess just trying to think of, I think what comes up a lot is like, how do things like this happen? And just kind of sticking with what the research and the data shows. There was a pretty definitive study out of Arizona that was published in 2021, and they looked at, basically it suggested that, subjective bias can play a role in the diversion disparities that we're seeing, or the disparities in diversion decisions, I should say. So again, this was in 2021 that it was published out of Arizona, and basically what they found was that Black, Hispanic, and Native American youth were significantly less likely to have their cases diverted, and they were also able to look at some of their case files. And what they found in those case files was that Black youth had 6 times as many negative or critical comments in them than their white counterparts. So there would be things like, they're not showing any remorse, they're not taking it seriously, things like that, essentially, that they're uncooperative. And then there were similar comments for Native American youth. That was like 4 times as many of those comments. And then for Hispanic youth, they had 3 times as many.
Courtney, do you know if that took into consideration the race of the administrator of that assessment, or who prepared that?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can find out for you, because
Just curious.
Yeah, I can.
Thank you.
Pull that study and get it to you. So all of that to say, that is going to have a negative impact on their opportunities for diversion as well. So this next slide is one that it is the most impactful for me. On the right, you can see what we would consider the intended outcomes of Senate Bill 200 and any other juvenile justice reforms or policies that we've put into place recently. You can see that there is a clear reduction in the total number of kids that are entering the system, and as they go deeper into the system, the numbers just get smaller and smaller, which is exactly what we want to see. Unfortunately, the graph on the left is what we've seen with Black youth. And so it is a smaller percentage of, still a disproportionate, but smaller percentage of complaints, but it is a 30% almost increase between the complaint numbers and the number of kids who are being sentenced or who are being transferred to adult court. So, and then to look a little bit closer at those youthful offender referrals. So this is the deepest point of the juvenile justice system. So being charged as an adult, they are referred to as youthful offenders. And there is a very clear, as I said, overrepresentation of Black youth at this point. If you look at youth of color collectively, they make up almost 70% of all of the kids who are going to circuit court. And again, when you look at counties like Jefferson or other counties that are a little bit larger, have more racial diversity in them, those disparities only widen as well. Just a few years ago, I think it was in 2019, black males in Jefferson County accounted for almost 90% of all of the youthful offender referrals in the county. So I want to jump ahead just a little bit to kind of start thinking about some potential recommendations just for this population. I think thinking a lot of primary prevention, kind of going upstream, is something that we need to focus on. Obviously, more data collection, I think both quantitative data and qualitative, around youthful offenders, so that we can start to analyze some of those systemic factors that may be leading to crime or to detention. So knowing where they're being arrested or picked up, kind of looking at like where they live, what type of resources are available in those areas. There could even be a working group that could be tasked with using that information to kind of find those pockets of need, and where more coordinated interventions can be implemented so that we can reduce recidivism, but also stop kids from ever coming into the system at all. And as I was thinking about this, one of the things that kind of came up for me was in Louisville, there are 3 zip codes that for the last, I'd say for the better part of the last 10 years, potentially even more than that, have accounted for about 1/3 of all of the commitments to DJJ, to the complaints that are made against kids that are 12 and under, and kids that are on probation, and there's probably other indicators as well. And the reason that I bring that up is because if you take a step back and kind of consider some of those systemic factors, you'll see that those zip codes, those 3 zip codes, also have disproportionately high rates of intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, disciplinary action in school, out-of-school suspensions, adult incarceration. We know that they are being impacted by violence in the community. There's also poverty, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and a lot of those related barriers. So lack of reliable transportation, of childcare, of jobs that are in the community that young people can access easily. Sometimes it can be challenging to even access resources for families. They also have there are also some very specific health issues, like they have very high rates of miscarriages, infant mortality, low birth weight, and in one of the zip codes, the residents are potentially at 10 times greater risk of lead poisoning just because of how old some of the houses are. So I bring all of that up again to just kind of point out that kids in those areas have a lot that they're having to deal with. And the expectation is that they be able to, leave home and, function properly in the community, in their schools. So again, developing that community kind of collaborative, coordinated approach to addressing these factors and finding solutions for the kids and for their families as well is really important. And again, it can just prevent them from ever, entering the system, or it can help us to cut those recidivism rates down a lot as well. A second recommendation would be in Tennessee, they have something called the Second Look Commission, and that's existed for about the past 13 years. And it's been primarily focused so far on looking at second or subsequent cases of severe child abuse. But this year, what they are doing is they're rolling out a Second Look Commission that's going to be focused on justice-involved youth. And so they'll be looking at second or subsequent cases of kids who have been charged as adults. They can also look at any instances of a kid who has maybe died in a facility or...
Who looks at those cases, Courtney?
They have a pretty diverse group. I want to say they have like some state employees, but then they also just have like community stakeholders as well.
Are they able to undo, if there's been an adjudication, are they able to reverse that or alter the sentencing of some kind?
That I don't know, but I have someone that I have been in contact with in Tennessee who did give me some information, so I'm happy to reach out to him and see if we can.
If you wouldn't mind connecting us, I've got some follow-up questions about that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. And so one of the other things that they do as well is that they come and they report to the General Assembly, and just this is a very oversimplified way of explaining it, but some of the findings are intended to address, how the state agencies respond, how data is being collected and used, and then they can also look at, laws, rules, and procedures that are used in court. But everything is just about trying to figure out if the way that we've currently responded to kids, either in the child welfare system or the justice system, is in the best interest of the kids and meeting the needs of that population.
Courtney, well done. I'm not going to cut you off, but Senator Berg has a question, and since we seem to be in a flow of asking questions in the midst of the presentation, we're going to stay with that.
Sure.
Senator Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking through some of this data, and it is just, I don't even know what word to use to describe it. So, but it looks like, on average, black kids are going to be arrested twice the rate that they belong in the population.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have some counties here
Yeah.
where it's 3 or 4 times. Are we passing that information on to those counties? Are they aware that their rates are so horrendously out of proportion to their population that there is almost no other possible explanation for the discrepancies? Who gets this information and how are we using it?
Courtney, I'm going to look to Rachel to provide
Right,
some
I was looking at her
insight.
too.
Rachel, introduce yourself for the record, if you would, please.
Absolutely. My name is Rachel Bingham. I'm with the Administrative Office of the Courts. And I've never seen this data before. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, sir. Just kidding. So to answer your question, yes, we do provide this data to the communities. Be very careful when you look at those community reports, because you also want to consider how many cases based upon percentages. So keep that in mind when you're especially looking at that rural, urban, suburban type of comparison. But yes, we provide this because it's important for the community to know what is coming into the juvenile justice system and what those numbers look like. And you're absolutely right that in some of the counties it is very concerning, obviously, to see where those populations of youth. I appreciate the fact that Courtney shared that we can even get into specific zip codes and narrow down pretty narrowly where some of these pockets are. But I think that you guys have heard these presentations before around what we know just in general about black youth do tend to, it's a fact, are charged more often. We are seeing a slight uptick of Hispanic, but it has not increased to anything that we can really say is as measurable as the constant with our black youth. In other states, it could be, as Courtney referenced a study out west, it could be, a different population based upon what that state looks like. But for here, it is the black youth. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, but 4
Members.
5 times the rate of their population.
Members, please take note that in your packet is some very detailed county-level information that AOC has provided that sheds further light on the conversation. Rachel, thank you. Dr. Berg, do you have anything else? Please continue.
All right, thanks. Okay. So this is one that this is a graph that I wanted to include. It's a broader equity issue. And I just think it's important to remember the experiences of some of the kids who make up this data. So this graph represents more than 3,500 kids, I believe, who have been diagnosed with a disability of some kind. And I think anecdotally, we probably know that there are some kids who may have not been diagnosed, who have been in detention, or may not have been treated or undertreated, misdiagnosed. There's any number of factors. And I also wanted to point out with that, well, first of all, that the majority on here, almost 31%, have said that they have been diagnosed with more than one disability. And we're in DJJ, which is very concerning. But a few years ago, there was a presentation about kind of like the trauma histories of kids who were in detention in Kentucky. And the person who gave that presentation talked about how 93% of the kids who were in detention at that time had experienced at least one major life trauma, and about 78% had experienced 6 of them. And again, those were kids that were in detention at that time. Okay. So kind of moving on to recommendations, and I've kind of gone through some of these a little bit, so I'm just going to jump ahead and I'll still do the recommendations. But I think the first thing is obviously lifting up the success that we've seen over the years of the diversion program. We see a decrease in public and status offenses post-COVID, and the diversion success rates have remained mostly steady, anywhere in the 80th or 90th percentile. When you pull out data for young children, again, those that are 12 and under, there's a very similar track record of success. Since 2016, the rate or the success rate for diversion among children in that age group has been over 90%. The most recent data shows that they had a 94% success rate. And when you look at the recidivism rates also for that young children population, there's been a steady decline since 2016. So if you were able to look at a chart, I'm sorry I didn't include it in here, the recidivism rate in 2016 for young kids was more than 25%, and the most recent data shows that it's actually down to 8% now. So again, to clarify, that is the percentage of kids who are 12 and under who recidivated within 1 year of successfully completing their diversion. So it has been tremendously successful.
Gordon, just spend one moment, because that slide, you've done a nice job with your percentages, but you touched on the fact that there's a significant difference between the raw numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Very significant difference between the raw numbers of 2017, that status line of 4,238 versus 2022, 1,973. Those are lives that are very positively impacted by not going into the system.
Correct.
And so thanks for the percentage slide, but if we had a trend line showing those raw numbers, it would be declining rapidly. So
yes, yeah.
Good point. Thank you.
And that is something, if you're interested, that we can probably send to you as well, because I think I have that.
Get that
also.
to Brandon, if you would. That would be good.
Absolutely. Okay, and the last slide, again, looking kind of at diversion, so expanding diversion as one of the recommendations for working with this population. Research has consistently shown that for most youth, diversion is actually more effective than going through a formal court process. It reduces their recidivism rates, and it also improves public safety. There have been countless studies that have replicated these findings. When you look at kids who don't go to court, have never been to court, versus those who are continuously having their cases heard in court, there is a clear, the outcomes essentially are clear for the kids who do have to go to court. They are more likely to be rearrested. They're more likely to be subsequently incarcerated. They're more likely to engage in violence in their communities, and also to be associated with more delinquent peers. And again, it is very pronounced when you look at the kids who don't go to court versus those who do. Educational attainment is another thing where you'll see that clear disparity, where if you're not going to court versus going to court, the kids who are in court have higher rates of dropout. They are less likely to go to college. There's even some research and data that shows that in adulthood, they tend to make less money than the kids who had their cases resolved outside of court or through diversion. Diversion is also a really good opportunity for us to get at the root causes of the behaviors. As I said before about finding those pockets of needs, it really does ensure that we can create responses or interventions that are tailored to the individual, instead of just using a one-size-fits-all solution. And when I say that it prioritizes public safety as well, the fewer kids that are going into the system, it frees up a lot of resources. So staff capacity can increase at each decision point. And again, there's resources that we can be dedicating to people who are probably in greater need of them. And finally, I also just want to reiterate that the recommendation here is to just try to expand upon a lot of the great work that's already been done. If you look at data from fiscal year 2009 to 2019, the average rate for successful diversion during this time frame was about 21% versus 34% for kids who went to court. So only 1 in 5 kids who had their cases successfully diverted would subsequently have another complaint within a year versus 1 in 3 kids who went to court. They would have a subsequent complaint within 1 year. So that is all I have.
Senator Neal, you have a question, sir?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. That information is interesting. And you may have partially answered this. How do you define success? I understand the recidivism piece.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the factor, or do you have another construct that you use to define success of those that are diverted?
Did you? I don't know if she can.
So I think it'd be best if I respond to that just based upon being over the coordinated worker program. For us, success is very much based upon what we consider to be the principles of effective interventions, and those are increasing pro-social, pro-peer, pro-opportunities around educational components, and doing things, being able to give kids those resources and supports for them to be successful. So for us, diversion success is more of it is a broader concept than just saying they have to do a compliance. It really is, are we changing how kids are perceiving antisocial behaviors? Are we offering them the opportunities for pro-social engagements? Are we able to provide them with resources and supports? And so that question becomes a little tricky, and it's something that in diversion programs is more challenging to answer, because what you're really looking at doing is impacting the ability for kids to not make antisocial decisions. And that opportunity is to really be able to get them engaged with more pro-social type resources. They still have the option for things like if they need substance use disorder, or if they need mental health resources, or if they need other types of services and supports, they're able to access those. It's very much a comprehensive case plan, as you would see also in a similar child welfare type case.
So your hard indicator is whether there's recidivism or not.
The hard indicator is always whether we see them again.
And the other indicators are assessments of how well they do in various aspects in their diverted life.
Yes, sir. You said it much more smoothly than I did. Much more smoothly.
I'm
Thank
leave
you.
it right there. Thank you so much.
Representative Herron.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the chairman for bringing today's committee together. I think that as we are sitting here and as we're listening to this presentation, we also have to keep in mind of what we heard prior to. These two things go hand in hand. And so I think that you all did a great job of bringing these two issues and bringing these two committees together. So I commend you on that and thank you. And hopefully we can continue to have more joint committees like this during the interim. Courtney, my question for you is, and I think I know the answer, but can you just for the record tell us what those 3 zip codes are?
It's 40210, 40211, and 40212.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Steve Gold, Henderson County Attorney. You have
Thank
a question.
you, Mr. Chairman. I want to piggyback a little bit on what Senator Neal was asking about, because I think that really cut to a lot of some of the data that you're talking about. But first, I want to thank Kentucky Youth Advocates for everything you do, helping those of us involved in this to know what's going on with data. It was one of your data books about 12 or 13 years ago that got our district judge and I together looking at what was going on locally and trying to figure out how to do things better and smarter that led to me sitting here today. So thank you for what you do. On that issue of what is a successful diversion, I want to talk a little bit about that. For context, Henderson is we're a county of about 50,000 people, but we're right across the river from Evansville, Indiana, third largest city in Indiana, right next to Davis County, which is Owensboro. So we're resource adjacent, but we don't have a lot of resources within the county. But But what we find is that there aren't a lot of great resources for our diversions, particularly in the mental health world. And some of the diversions that we're seeing sometimes don't have the impact that they would have if we had more, particularly mental health resources. And then to get to Senator Neal and his discussion of what is a successful diversion, we have diversions going where there has been a reoffense, yet it's still considered a successful diversion. And this is probably a question more for Rachel. It's still considered a successful diversion within the diversion world. And so I think this is where you see some prosecutorial overrides, because we see this and we're like, okay, this has clearly not been successful because we now have this new charge. Maybe this is going to take the additional resources, the additional oversight that the district court has. And generally, I understand, I absolutely believe meaningful diversion is very important. However, when there's been that recidivism there, and still the prior case is in a diversion, I take it that your premise is that any override is bad because, and I get that there is research out there that shows that if you can keep a kid from coming to court, they're more likely to do better in school, all those things. But when there has been a reoffense, do you believe that there should be even more diversions or more attempts at diversions?
I think I can only really go by what is written in the law, which just says that, up to 3 for the misdemeanors and the status offenses. And I think, being able to connect with the kids and be able to provide them with the services that they need and make sure that they're getting those, having a diversion program that is very tailored toward whatever their needs are. I understand the larger issue around like a lack of resources. I mean, that's definitely valid. We see that across the state. I think we've seen things like that, just even like workforce related issues, just, juvenile justice system, but also in child welfare and a lot of other systems as well. So I know that doesn't necessarily
It's a tough
answer your
question.
question, but yeah, there is that gray area there.
When we see those
Yeah.
additional antisocial behaviors coming forward, we're asked, should this stay at diversion or should it go to court? And, particularly when there's a victim involved, it's hard to look at that victim and say, well, the first diversion didn't work out. It's going to be tried again. We're not going to ask that it come to court and that a judge actually see this. So,
Yeah.
but I also understand there's so many competing issues here, and finding that right balance is so difficult. And I want to thank you all for being part of providing that data that helps inform those decisions. Thank you.
Yeah. And one thing that I did touch on in the presentation, I think maybe even having like a group who can look at some of these cases can kind of also help us to come up with maybe more solutions or more interventions that could be more effective like across the state. If there are areas, obviously if there are areas that are very resource rich, then they may have more options than a county that kind of has like that research or resource desert. But I think if we're even able, because I'm going off of what like the numbers and the
Sure.
legal languages, and don't necessarily have like the case files where I can pull specific examples like you were sharing too.
I'm all in favor of more interventions.
Ms. Bingham to respond to this, and then Senator Webb will be on deck.
Thank you. Just to build on that also, Steve and I, we've had conversations around this space multiple times. I think we have to always keep in mind adolescent brain development, us raising our own kids, that a lot of times our kids need, extra help and assistance and attention to make better decisions. So we see in diversion that oftentimes we've got kids that are making bad choices and we're getting them at a point in time that we're trying to change a trajectory, but that also takes some patience and some compromise, and sometimes those little steps So you missed 30 days over the last 2 months, and now you've only missed 10 days for us. That's growth. That's improvement. And so we're looking at it from a lens of where we can work with these kids in a lot of ways where they are and move them forward based upon where they could developmentally, intellectually, all the things that could be, contributing. Doesn't take away from what you're saying at all, because I think what you really hit on to me is a gap that I think we all need to, in this particular bodies need to take into consideration. The Court Designated Worker Program does not purchase services. We are dependent on the communities. And the communities are the places and the spaces that we want our kids to be able to get these supports. And the data shows if they're able to get that, they're going to be more successful. So I'll also make sure that we get to Brandon a recent paper by the Sentencing Project that talks specifically about diversion and all of the impact, and should also lead to a lot of the data nationally that they're finding that should help with some of your questions about, how many chances are we going to give our kids?
Thank you, Ms. Bingham. I have Senator Webb to be followed by Senator Neal. Senator Webb.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that you all have historically done through the years. But as someone who's represented a lot of children in the last 30 years, I'm going to agree with my prosecutor down there in several instances that I had a call this week. A kid called me to represent him on a civil matter, and we were talking about his juvenile experience where he was detained, much against my objection at the time in the Boyd County Center years ago. And he said, we were talking about that, and he said, that I've not had another issue since then. I didn't want to go back there. To that child, that had value. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where every case is different. Mm-hmm. I think our local prosecutors and judges know these individuals better than anyone. And that's why I've always been an advocate and will continue to be for flexibility in that sentencing process or that override process. Not to say there shouldn't be criteria and database protocols in place and avenues for me to take exception to that from time to time. But I just maintaining the flexibility in the system for those instances and for those individuals where that does make a difference is important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, I have Senator Neal to be followed by Ms. Weeder. Is that correct? Senator Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've got to be careful in this area. My background is as a juvenile probation officer and someone that did extensive work with juveniles in the legal field. And I know that what's happening now, they're saying we have a different brand of juvenile out here, I guess, on the violent side. But let me point out, these judgments are subjective. And we can set objective criteria, but to make those judgments in various and varying circumstances is really subjective to a significant extent, and there's an exception to everything anybody says in this room. I think it might be worth our while to really revisit this subject matter and understand it better, as opposed to saying, I make a decision, this should be honored. How are they made? Are we talking about kids that come back and reoffend and it's armed robbery, or is it a violent offense? Are we talking about kids that are, stealing a comic book out of a store or something like that? I don't know, but I think it's worth taking a look at, and then look at it in the context of whether they reoffend or not, or whether I'm persuaded by the argument that they are making progress in terms of their engagement with various individuals who try to enable them to do better and see alternatives to antisocial behavior, so to speak. So I just think we ought to be careful about just saying, overrides are good, or we should just let kids off the hook. I think we ought to take a look at this and see what's really happening there. I just want to make that comment, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Neal. Ms. Weeder.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the data that you shared on the youth with disabilities in DJJ, and just kind of looking back at that slide. You may have mentioned this, but I didn't see where there was a summary of how many youth in DJJ have been identified with disabilities, or what proportion of the youth in DJJ have been identified with disabilities. And then the second piece of that is to what extent is their disability a factor in some of these key decision points related to, diversion or sentencing, to the extent that you can speak to that. I don't know that you can, but.
So what I can share is just with the data on this graph, this represented more than 3,500 kids that were in detention. I don't know if Rachel, if you have a sense of how that's...
This would be at intake.
Okay.
This would be at intake. So this would not be necessarily those committed to long-term detention. This is at the intake slide, comparable to what was addressed earlier. So it could be a short period of time. It could be a longer period of time based upon the court review and the hearing.
So of those young people, how many of them have the disabilities that were identified here? Was that 30?
So then what we can do is get for you the breakdown by the percentage
Okay.
for each of those categories, like we did some of the other slides,
Gotcha.
if that would help.
Okay.
I just want to clarify that this point of contact is not necessarily the commissioner's population in DJJ
Gotcha.
that she typically reports.
Okay.
And if you want, I can add that KEXAC, who's here, does the schools for all of our programs for residential detention, youth development, group homes, and looking at their 2022 census data, they had that 34% of our youth had an identified IEP special need.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And so is this being discussed during these different points of contact, or it's up to the judge to ask about it, or is it not typically part of the process? Or I'm just curious.
Great question, Rachel, if you'd like to share some more insights.
So I think what's relevant about this point of contact is we are getting information at our preliminary intake. It's our first contact. This is going to be solely youth sharing whether or not they have a disability. So it's personal disclosures or self-disclosure, and it is a tough area, full transparency with us in the court designated worker program, and it's something that we are getting better educated on how to address these various needs of our population and what we are able to provide at that early point to our judges. So we're limited on how making that call to the judge.
So, Rachel, a follow-up, if I could, specific to what Ms. Weeder is asking is, you're indicating that we're still in the infancy of collecting and utilizing this information. Do judges use this as a consideration in the process today or not? If a young person appears before you as a judge and you know that young person has a disability, is that influential or not?
Yes, sir. At that point of contact, when we've got the kids before the judge, yes. At this point of contact that we are doing our preliminary inquiry, we're not with the kids to that degree of time. Then they're going to have a court review. They're going to be before the judge. More information is going to be shared. At this point of contact, we may or may not have the information.
Good. If you would get the follow-up information, Rachel, that you've mentioned, get that to Brandon. He'll get it out to everyone here. I do not have any other questioners on the list. Any other members of the committee seeking any information or thoughts before we wrap up, and appreciate this group? Seeing none, thank you, KYA. Shout out to Terry Brooks and the whole team. As always, excellent work, and the data drives a lot of the decisions we make here, so thank you for that. I will encourage all members of the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity to remember to mark your calendars for our next meeting, which is scheduled for July the 24th at 1 p.m. If you show up here July the 4th, Brandon may not have the doors unlocked. So this meeting is adjourned. Thank you for your attendance.
There are a couple times where he listed